Have you ever stood in the woods at night and felt the silence press down on you? So heavy it almost feels alive. Out there, miles from anyone who could hear you scream, the darkness doesn't just surround you, it watches. You tell yourself the cabin walls will keep you safe, that the locked doors and shuttered windows will hold whatever waits outside. But what if the cabin isn't empty? What if it already belongs to something else? That's the fear I want you to hold on to as you listen tonight. These aren't just stories. They're confessions, whispered by people who swore they'd never tell what happened to them, people who thought silence might bury their terror. But silence never holds, not in the woods, not in those cabins. One of these accounts ends with something caught on tape, a sound that still circulates online, though no one has been able to prove if it's human. Another comes with a set of rules scribbled on an old page. Rules that, if broken, invite something into your life you will never be able to send back. And the last story, well, let's just say even the investigators who looked into it left with more questions than answers. I'm not here to comfort you. I'm here to tell you that when people vanish in the woods, when cabins are abandoned and left to rot, it's rarely just because of bad weather or failing health. Sometimes the reason is stranger. Sometimes it's darker. So before we begin, ask yourself, could you sit alone in a cabin with the forest groaning around you and not wonder who or what is just beyond the tree line? Could you hear footsteps in the attic and not climb the stairs? Could you ignore the mirror when it shifts your reflection into something not quite your own? You might think you could. You might tell yourself you'd stay calm, that you'd hold strong. But by the time these 3 stories are finished, you'll understand why some doors should never be opened, and why some cabins in the woods should be left to crumble quietly into the dirt. The first account comes from someone who thought isolation would bring peace. They weren't running from danger, just from heartbreak. You know the kind, when the noise of the city is too loud, when every familiar street corner feels poisoned with memories. A cabin in the woods, far away from everything, seemed like the cure. Solitude, fresh air, quiet. But here's the truth people forget. Silence in the forest isn't empty. It's layered. Crickets, shifting branches, the slow exhale of wind between the trees. And when those sounds stop, when the night holds its breath, you start to realize you're not the only one listening. This story begins with a man alone at the edge of the wilderness, telling himself the forest was harmless. But the woods have a way of peeling you open. At first it's subtle, a feeling of being watched, a shadow that lingers too long, footsteps you tell yourself are just deer. And then comes the part he never expected. Because when he finally tried to record the silence to prove to himself it was nothing, he caught something else. Something no one has ever been able to explain. This is his story. I went to the cabin because I thought I needed to be alone. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. After the breakup, after the endless arguments and slammed doors, after my apartment started feeling more like a tomb than a home, I figured solitude would be the cure. Fresh air, quiet, the kind of silence that forces you to breathe slower. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to a family friend who hadn't used it in years. A 2-hour drive from the nearest gas station, hidden at the end of a gravel road that wound through pine trees like a vein. The first time I saw it, I thought it was perfect. Weathered wood, a crooked porch, a stone chimney that looked like it had seen decades of winters. It felt like somewhere I could think, somewhere I could reset. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, cracked open a cheap beer, and sat on the porch while the sun dipped beneath the trees. The forest looked endless from there, like it could swallow you whole without effort. Still, I convinced myself the isolation was exactly what I wanted. I was wrong. On the second night, I heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, like someone pacing through the undergrowth just beyond the edge of the tree line. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe a coyote, nothing unusual for the woods. But then the steps stopped, perfectly timed with the moment I froze. And in the silence that followed, I swore I could feel someone watching me. I laughed it off, even spoke out loud to myself, "Get a grip. You're fine." But the forest didn't laugh back. It just held its breath. The next morning I found footprints. Not paw prints, not the scattered tracks of animals, human, barefoot. The mud by the porch was pressed with distinct toes and arches, angled as though whoever or whatever had stood there had been watching the cabin for a long time. That's when I called my buddy Derek. He was the kind of guy who always knew how to diffuse my paranoia. I told him about the prints, about the footsteps. He chuckled on the other end. "Man, you're in the middle of nowhere. It's probably some hiker or hell, maybe even your imagination. You've been on edge since everything with Emily." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the image of someone standing barefoot in the mud, staring at my window while I slept. That night, I made sure to lock the doors. I closed every curtain. I even dragged a chair across the floor and jammed it under the handle of the front door like some cliche from an old horror movie. Then I tried to sleep. At 3:12 a.m., I woke up to tapping on the glass. Not random creaks, not the cabin settling, tapping, rhythmic, deliberate. I didn't move at first. I didn't breathe. Just listened as the sound traveled slowly from one window to the next, circling the cabin like someone was dragging a finger along the glass. My phone was on the nightstand. My hand trembled as I picked it up and pressed record. I thought, if I capture this, maybe I'll prove it to myself. Maybe I'll prove it's nothing. But it wasn't nothing. The sound stopped. Silence. And then, through the darkness, through the cheap curtains, I saw a face pressed against the glass. It was pale, too pale. The features stretched wrong, like someone had molded it out of wax and left it too close to the fire. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, reflecting the faint glow of my phone screen. And then, just as quickly as I noticed, it slipped back into the blackness. I don't remember grabbing the knife from the kitchen. I don't remember pacing the floor until the sun came up. But when daylight finally seeped through the cracks, I felt stupid, exhausted, like maybe I'd dreamt it. Then I played back the recording. At first it was just the creaks of the cabin, the faint sound of wind. And then came the breathing, heavy, wet. Not outside the cabin, but inside. The mic had picked it up right next to me, inches from where I'd been lying. I called Derek again, voice shaking. "There was someone here, man. I've got proof." Breathing. It was inside. He tried to calm me down, told me to pack up, drive back, crash at his place until I sorted my head out. He kept saying, "You're safe now. You're talking to me, you're fine." But as he said that, I heard something on the line. A faint exhale. Not from him, not from me, like a third voice breathing between us. I hung up. I didn't sleep again. I waited until the morning, shoved everything into my car, and drove until the trees thinned and the highway finally opened. I never went back to that cabin. The owner later told me he stopped using it years ago because he always had the feeling someone was in the woods, waiting. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I still play the recording. And every time I hear it, the steady, heavy breathing. But the worst part isn't the sound itself. It's the faintest whisper buried beneath it. A word, my name, and no one I've shared it with has ever been able to explain it. If you're still here listening after that first story, you probably feel the same chill I do every time I think about it. The idea that something could be standing just beyond the tree line, waiting. That's the problem with cabins in the woods. They're supposed to be escapes, places we run to when the world feels too heavy. But the deeper you go into the forest, the more you realize how far you've left safety behind. And tell me honestly, Have you ever stayed in one? The kind of place where the air is so still at night that you can hear your own heartbeat, where every creak in the walls sounds like a footstep just one room away. People talk about the woods being peaceful, but peace feels different when you can't shake the thought that you're not alone. That last story wasn't the only account like it. There are countless others, most never told publicly. Sometimes the people who live through them are too afraid to admit what they saw. Other times, well, let's just say they don't get the chance to tell anyone at all. But the next story, it's different. Because this one doesn't start with the feeling of being watched from the outside. It begins with a set of rules, written down inside the cabin itself. Warnings from someone who knew exactly what would happen if they weren't followed. And like most of us, the person who found those rules thought they were just a joke, a quirky relic from whoever owned the place before. They were wrong, and the price of ignoring those rules was worse than anything waiting in the trees. When my uncle died, I didn't expect to inherit anything. We hadn't spoken in years. He was the black sheep of the family, the kind of relative people mentioned in hushed tones during holidays. No wife, no kids, just rumors and a handful of stories about him disappearing into the mountains for months at a time. So when the lawyer called to tell me he'd left me his hunting cabin, I laughed. I thought it was some kind of mistake, but it wasn't. A week later, I was driving 3 hours north with a key on a rusted ring and a folder of old property papers sliding around my passenger seat. The cabin was strange. From the outside, it looked like any other place you'd find in the woods. Dark timber walls, a sagging roof, a porch where time had eaten away the railings. But stepping inside was different. Dust clung to everything. The air was thick, like it hadn't been opened in years. And right on the kitchen table, sitting in the center like it was waiting for me, was a single sheet of yellowed paper. There were 3 rules written in shaky handwriting. Never sleep upstairs. Do not look into the hallway mirror after midnight. Keep the basement door locked. That was it. No explanation. No signature. Just rules. I remember smirking, shaking my head. My uncle had always been odd. Maybe this was his sense of humor, one final eccentricity left behind. Still, I couldn't help but feel the hairs on my arms stand up as I read them. That first night, I slept downstairs on the couch. Not because I believed the rules, but because I was too tired to haul my stuff upstairs. Funny how easy it is to tell yourself you're not afraid when you're making excuses. Around midnight, I woke up to creaking above me. Slow, deliberate steps pacing across the upstairs floorboards. My heart stuttered. The cabin had been locked when I arrived. No car outside but mine. No sign anyone else had been there in years. I held my breath and listened. Every step louder than the last until it stopped, directly above me. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning I checked upstairs. Empty. Dust still thick, undisturbed. No footprints. No sign of anyone. But I couldn't shake the unease crawling under my skin. The rules. The first rule, never sleep upstairs. By the second night, I told myself I was being paranoid. That's how fear works. It seeps into your logic, makes shadows into monsters. I distracted myself by exploring more of the cabin. That's when I found the hallway mirror. It hung between the living room and the back bedrooms. An old warped piece of glass in a wooden frame. My uncle had covered it with a sheet, nailed at the corners. I don't know why I pulled it down. Curiosity, stupidity, maybe both. I wish I hadn't. The glass was foggy, but the reflection was clear enough. And something about it was off. Not wrong exactly, just delayed. I lifted my hand and for half a second the reflection lagged. Just long enough to make my stomach drop. I laughed it off, called myself sleep-deprived. But I nailed the sheet back over it before nightfall. That night I dreamed I was standing in the hallway staring into the mirror. Only it wasn't me staring back. The reflection's eyes were darker, hollow, like they were bruised black. Its mouth moved, whispering words I couldn't hear. When I woke, my ears were ringing like I'd been listening to something too loud for too long. Rule 2: do not look into the hallway mirror after midnight. I wanted to leave. Every instinct told me to throw my bag in the car and drive until the trees disappeared in my rear view. But something kept me there. A gnawing pull, a need to understand why my uncle had lived here, why he'd left this place and me the way he had. On the third day, I made a mistake. The basement door had always been locked. Heavy iron latch, rusted shut. I'd ignored it, convincing myself it was just storage. But when I passed it that afternoon, I heard something. Scratching. Slow. Measured, like nails dragging down the wood from the inside. I froze. The sound stopped. I should have walked away, should have ignored it. But I couldn't. My hands shook as I unlatched the lock, forcing the swollen door open. The air that poured out was damp, metallic, and freezing cold. The stairs led down into darkness. I used my phone's flashlight, each step creaking under my weight. At the bottom was a small room, lined with old furniture covered in sheets. In the center, nailed to the wall, was another mirror. Not the same one from the hallway. Bigger, cleaner, its surface shimmered in the light like water. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming to stop. But I didn't. The reflection showed the basement as it was, but not exactly. The sheets over the furniture were gone. The room looked lived in, and standing in the corner, just at the edge of the frame, was a figure. I spun around, nothing. When I turned back, the figure was closer, pale, thin, its face hidden by tangled hair. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone. My breathing echoed in the room, too loud, too fast. And then I realized it wasn't just my breathing. The reflection was breathing, too, louder, ragged. And when I turned to run, the reflection didn't move. It stayed, staring at me with a grin that spread too wide, splitting its face like a crack in porcelain. I slammed the basement door shut, locked it, and shoved a chair against the handle. Then I sat on the floor, shaking until dawn bled through the windows. I didn't sleep again. That morning I packed. I didn't care about the inheritance anymore. I didn't care about answers. Whatever my uncle had been living with, whatever had written those rules, it wasn't human. As I was leaving, I glanced back at the hallway. The sheet over the mirror had fallen, and for just a moment before I forced myself through the door, I saw my reflection. But it wasn't me. It was smiling, and I wasn't. If you've made it this far, you're stronger than most. I've shared these accounts before, and I know plenty of people who clicked away long before the second story ended. Maybe it's easier to laugh at rules on yellowed paper than to imagine what happens when you break them. But some of you know better. Some of you have felt it. The weight of silence in an old place. The chill of a mirror that seems to breathe when you're not looking. The deeper I dig into stories like these, the more I wonder if cabins aren't built to protect us at all. Maybe they're traps, boxes that lure us inside so something else can press closer, waiting for the night when we finally slip. And if you're listening now, ask yourself, what if these aren't just stories? What if those rules are real warnings? Because the next account, it's one of the strangest I've ever read. It doesn't end with a scream in the night or a shadow in the window. It ends with something missing, something no one has been able to explain. The kind of story that keeps even investigators awake. We were never supposed to find it. That's the thought that haunts me the most whenever I think back on that trip, whenever I wake in the middle of the night convinced I still smell wood smoke on the air, even though I live nowhere near the woods anymore. It started as nothing more than a weekend hike with two friends, Carly and Mason. We were all restless 20-somethings, chasing the thrill of doing something raw and off the grid. The plan was simple: hike a marked trail in the national forest, camp one night under the stars, and hike back the next day. Easy, harmless. But somewhere along the path, Mason spotted a narrow break in the trees. Barely more than a deer trail, overgrown and half hidden. He grinned like a kid and said, "Shortcut." Carly rolled her eyes, but I followed anyway. That's always how it went. Mason daring, me tagging along, Carly complaining but never leaving. We walked for what felt like an hour. No trail markers. Just trees pressing in tighter and tighter until I started to wonder if we'd made a mistake. And then we saw it. The cabin. It stood in a small clearing, tilted and sagging, but undeniably there. The roof was patched with moss, the windows fogged with grime. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, though there was no sound, no movement. We froze. Mason whistled low. "That's not on the map." It wasn't. I had studied the trail guides obsessively before we left, and there were no structures within miles of where we should have been. But there it was, waiting. Carly wanted to leave immediately. Her voice shook when she said, "If it's not marked, we're trespassing. And who's keeping that fire going?" But Mason, of course, laughed. "Or we just found the perfect place to crash for the night. Beats pitching a tent in the mud." I wanted to agree with her, but the truth was the cabin looked inviting. The air was growing colder, the sun already sinking. And there was something about the sight of that chimney smoke, curling against the gray sky, that made me want to step closer. We did. The door was unlocked. Inside smelled of damp earth and wood ash. Furniture sat where it had been left. Chairs around a table, an iron stove, even beds against the walls. Dust clung to everything, but the fire in the hearth was warm, fresh. Carly refused to sit. "This isn't right. Someone's here." But we searched the cabin top to bottom and it was empty. No bags, no clothes, nothing. Just furniture, a few chipped plates, and that stubborn fire. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt staged. We tried to ignore it. Mason stretched out on one of the beds, claiming it was the best find of the year. I sat at the table, staring into the darkened windows. And that's when I noticed it. The view outside was wrong. The window facing east showed the clearing, just as I expected. But the one facing west, it showed water, a lake. There was no lake anywhere near our route. And when I moved to the northern window, I saw something even stranger, trees bent at odd angles, their branches twitching, though the air inside was perfectly still. I told Mason. He shrugged. "Maybe the glass is warped? Old cabins do weird stuff." But Carly whispered, "It's not the glass." That night we tried to sleep. I laid awake on a thin mattress, staring at the ceiling. And then I heard it, whispering, not outside, not beyond the walls, but from inside the cabin itself. Words I couldn't catch, voices that slipped just out of reach like smoke. Carly sat up across the room, wide-eyed. "You hear it too," she mouthed. Mason didn't stir. He slept, or pretended to. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, until it felt like the room was filled with a crowd just beyond my vision. I pressed my hands to my ears. It didn't help. The sound was inside me, rattling in my chest, clawing at my ribs. And then it stopped. Dead silence. In that silence, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The fire had gone out. The hearth, warm all day, sat cold and black as if it hadn't been lit in years. The next morning, Mason swore we'd dreamed it all. He laughed when Carly begged us to leave, said we were letting the atmosphere mess with us. I wanted to believe him, but when we stepped outside, the clearing was gone. The cabin door opened not onto grass, but into dense trees. No sky above, no trail behind. Just forest, pressed so tight I could barely see through it. We stumbled around for hours, circling, searching for the clearing, the trail, anything familiar. But no matter how far we walked, when we turned back, the cabin was there, waiting. Carly broke first. She screamed at the trees, at Mason, at me, demanding we find the way out. Her voice cracked, raw. When she finally stopped, the woods were too quiet, like the world itself was listening. That night I didn't sleep at all. I sat at the table with my back to the fireless hearth, staring at the windows. Every time I blinked, the view shifted. Snow, then sand, then endless black water. And in each reflection, I swore I saw shapes moving closer. By morning, the cabin was gone. We woke on the trail, tents pitched, gear scattered like nothing had happened. Carly swore she never stepped inside. Mason swore we'd slept under the stars. But I remembered the whispers, the windows, the fire that had never burned. And when I checked my pack, I found something that didn't belong. An old, chipped plate, the same kind I'd seen on the cabin table. I don't know how it got there. Years later, I still dream about it. Sometimes I wake in my apartment, swearing I hear that same whispering just beyond the walls. Sometimes I smell smoke, faint and acrid like the start of a fire. And sometimes when I look out my window, I don't see the street below. I see trees, and I know the cabin is still waiting for me. People like to say that stories are just stories, that if something doesn't make sense, it can't be real, that the woods don't hide places that don't belong, and cabins can't exist one day and vanish the next. But tell that to the part of my brain that still wakes up at night, expecting to hear whispers. Tell that to Carly, who refuses to go camping anymore, even in a backyard. Or to Mason, who laughs whenever I bring it up, but won't look me in the eye when he does. Here's what really unsettles me. If it wasn't real, then why did I bring something back with me? That chipped plate still sits in the back of my closet. I've tried throwing it away, but it always seems to turn up again, like the cabin doesn't want me to forget, like it's reminding me you were there. And maybe that's the scariest part. Not that the cabin existed, but that it chose us. That for reasons I'll never understand, it opened its door and let us step inside. Because if it could happen once, who's to say it can't happen again? Who's to say the next time I go for a hike, or even just walk home at night, I won't turn a corner and find that door waiting for me? I sometimes wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed longer, if we'd listened to the whispers instead of covering our ears, if we'd kept looking out the windows until the shapes pressed their faces against the glass. Would we ever have come back? Or would we have become part of the cabin story, waiting for the next group of hikers to stumble in? The truth is, there are places in this world that don't want to be found. And once you've seen them, once you've stepped inside, they don't let you go so easily. So if you're ever hiking off trail and you spot a cabin that isn't supposed to be there, don't go inside, because once you do, it's already too late.